The girl's fingers found his jacket first. Not a tug, not a tap, a burial, both hands pressing into the fabric of a suit that had never been touched by anyone without permission, gripping it the way a body grips the last solid thing before a fall. He felt it before his brain had named it. Before he had identified what it was, his stride had already broken. His heel came down wrong. The marble registered it. His body registered it. And the lobby of KW Capitol Tower, which had been built specifically to communicate that nothing could touch Quanhan, went very quiet. He looked down, twins. A boy and a girl. 3 years old, maybe. Dark brown skin slick with tears, identical faces destroyed by identical terror. The girl had her cheek pressed against his leg, both hands still buried in his jacket, and she was not making a sound. She had moved past the sound. She was in the stage that comes after sound, the hollow stage, the stage where the body has exhausted every other option and has gone completely still except for the shaking. The boy was looking up at him. The expression on that small face was the thing Quanhan would never fully explain to anyone who asked him later how the morning had begun. It was not panic. It was not desperation. It was worse than both. It was the expression of someone who has been making decisions alone for too long. A 3-year-old who had already tried everything he could think of and was now performing one final calculation about whether this particular stranger was worth the risk of trusting. He decided, "Mister, please. My mommy won't wake up. 3 words. 4 words." Hayan would count them later, in the car, in the dark. He would count them because they were the words that ended one version of his life and began another, and he wanted to know exactly how few it had taken. Welcome to AfroSeoul Velvet Diaries. If you are new here, this channel exists for one reason only: to build the stories that live in the part of you that most content never reaches. We go dark. We go deep. We do not apologize. If that is why you came, subscribe right now and turn notifications on, because this series will find every feeling you thought you had locked away. And if you have been here before, you already know. Let's go. Here is what you need to understand before this story can break you properly. Quanhan was 34 years old and had been the CEO of KW Capital Group since 29. He had not inherited the title, had not been groomed for it, had spent 5 consecutive years arriving before everyone in the building and leaving after everyone in the building, had identified 3 acquisition targets his predecessors had been too comfortable to see, had executed all 3 with a precision that made his own legal team uncomfortable, and when the board convened for succession discussion, there had been no real debate. He was the only name that functioned without qualification. What the board called his greatest asset was not his intelligence. It was his cold, not cruelty. Cruelty requires passion. What Hayan had was something more engineered, more deliberate, more expensive to maintain. The ability to enter a room where emotion was the central variable and operate as though it wasn't. To read a situation that would make most people hesitate and move through it without friction. Feeling, in his framework, was not weakness in the soft, personal sense. It was a technical liability, a calculation error that disguised itself as data. He had not always believed this, but the person who built that belief was not in the lobby on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. He was buried somewhere Hayan had not visited in 11 years and was not planning to visit today. That plan had just been changed. The lobby of KW Capitol Tower had been designed, at significant expense, to feel like the end of argument. Black marble floors, 40-foot ceilings of tempered glass. Air systems so sophisticated the temperature never varied by more than a single degree regardless of what was happening outside. Light that fell in precise angles calculated to make everyone who entered feel slightly smaller than the building itself. It was not a space where human tragedy was supposed to happen. It was a space engineered to prevent the human from having any power over the architectural at all. Director Choi stood 3 paces behind Hayan with a tablet and a schedule and the very specific stillness of a man watching something that does not have a category yet. Hayan had not moved. Milo was still looking up at him, still gripping. And because children do not know when to stop, because they have not yet learned to manage down their own need for the comfort of other people, his voice found more volume this time. We already tried to wake her up. We tried lots of times. She won't open her eyes for breakfast. We already tried lots of times. Hayan's jaw tightened. Choi would describe it later as watching a system receive an input it had no architecture to process. Every framework attempting to engage and finding no surface to grip, because there was no protocol for this. There was no strategic response. There was no version of this moment that his training, his experience, his 11 years of building distance into a professional identity had prepared him to handle. He crossed the lobby. The stride was wrong and everyone in the building knew it. Not the boardroom stride. Not the sidewalk stride. Something else moved through his body toward the east reception desk, and every pair of eyes in the atrium tracked it without meaning to, the way eyes track a change in pressure before a storm. He crouched beside Jessica Marlowe and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Her pulse was there. Faint, unstable, but present. He held his fingers there for 4 full seconds, counting, and in those 4 seconds something happened behind his eyes that his face did not show. Something that was not relief exactly. Something that was its precursor. The sharp arrest of a possibility he had not yet allowed himself to fully form. He looked at her face. Young. That was the first observation, the one that embarrassed him later because it was the least relevant data available. She was young, and she was beautiful in the way that belongs entirely to structure and bone, the kind that does not require consciousness to operate. Her natural hair had come loose from where it had been pinned and was resting against her cheek. The blazer she was wearing was professional and clean except for the left cuff, which had been repaired with thread that did not precisely match, the repair of someone who noticed the damage and addressed it with what was at hand rather than replacing it. Her breathing was shallow. Too shallow. The document envelope she had been holding had half slipped from her fingers and was resting against the floor at an angle that suggested she had been upright when her body stopped cooperating. He picked up the envelope. He read the label, Marlowe Legal Consulting. Case file reference KWAG 202411. Priority delivery. Something moved through Quanhan's body that had nothing to do with the ambulance he was about to call. It had nothing to do with the children behind him, or the lobby around him, or the meeting he was already late for. It moved through him the way a recognition moves when it arrives at the worst possible time, when the information is exactly right, and the context is completely wrong and you have no framework to hold both simultaneously. He knew that reference number. He knew it the way you know a piece of work that demanded 3 days of genuine attention, because it was that precise, that structurally intelligent. KWAG 202411 was the Hanyang Media acquisition, the most complex domestic deal his company had executed in 6 years. The external legal architecture had come from an anonymous consultancy his legal director had sourced through a referral chain. He had asked twice who the consultant was. Both times the answer returned identical. She prefers anonymity. She works through intermediaries only. She is particular. He had spent 6 months in professional proximity to the mind behind this face without ever being allowed to attach a face to it. She was unconscious on his floor. Her children were pressing against his back. He stood. He turned to Choi. His voice came out level in the specific way his voice always came out level, the way that required no effort because level was simply the default register. Ambulance. Now, clear the lobby. Choi moved. The lobby moved. Personnel evaporated to the perimeters with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to read their employers' commands the way soldiers read terrain. Security formed a perimeter. A junior assistant ran for the first aid station. And Hayen stood in the center of everything that was now orbiting him and looked down at a woman whose work he had admired for 6 months without knowing her name. Me pulled at his sleeve. Her voice was very small and very serious. She asked him if he could make her mommy wake up. He looked at her. She was watching him with enormous eyes that had used up all their tears and were now operating on pure assessment. The look of a child who has already been disappointed by the world once this morning and is trying to calculate whether disappointment is about to happen again. It was the most specific kind of trust, the provisional kind, offered one more time by someone who has already run out of other options, and the responsibility in it landed on Hayen Kwon like something physical. He went down to her level, looked directly into her face. I'm getting help for your mommy right now. I need you and your brother to stay right next to me. Can you do that? She studied him for exactly 4 seconds, the full assessment. Then she put her hand inside his. Her fingers were so small against his palm that something in his architecture shifted without his consent. He felt it, and he did not name it, and he did not pull away. And if this story is already doing something to you, if it has already found the part of you that recognizes something real when it arrives, then hit that like button right now. It is the reason content like this survives on this platform. It is the reason we can keep going. and do not stop watching. Because what happens in the next 9 minutes is the scene we have been building toward since the first word. The ambulance was 9 minutes out. 9 minutes is a long time when someone you are responsible for is unconscious on a marble floor, and you are holding the hand of her 3-year-old daughter, and the only thing standing between these children and absolute collapse is whatever competence you have built around yourself like a fortress. Hayan knew this, and he worked it. He called the ambulance himself on his personal phone, gave the address and a clinical description of Jessica's condition. Pulse rate, respiratory pattern, probable hypoglycemic episode, no visible trauma, 2 minor children present. He gave it the way he gave every critical briefing. Precisely. Without pause, without the upward vocal movement of uncertainty, he asked Milo how old he was, 3. Milo said it while watching his mother with the monitoring intensity of a child who has decided to be in charge of a situation despite having no tools for it. He asked me her name. She told him without looking up from where she was watching her mother's chest rise and fall. He asked them both whether their mommy had eaten breakfast. No. She said she wasn't hungry. She was holding her head like this, and Milo pressed both palms against the sides of his own head in demonstration, and she said she just needed coffee, and then she'd be fine. He said it with the precision of a child who had understood that this detail mattered and had been rehearsing it in his head in case someone important finally asked. The weight of those words arrived in Hayan's chest like something cold and structural. Not hypoglycemia as a medical event. Hypoglycemia as the end of a chain of decisions made by a person who did not have enough margin to make better ones. She had left home this morning without eating because something about this morning had made eating feel like a luxury she could defer. She had brought her children because the alternative had fallen through, and she could not afford to let this delivery fail. She had walked into his building running on coffee and willpower and the specific momentum of someone who does not let themselves stop because stopping costs too much, and her body had made the decision for her. The paramedics came through the lobby doors at 9 minutes and 11 seconds. Me let go of Hayan's hand when they lifted her mother onto the stretcher. She moved to the side of it. She reached up and touched Jessica's arm with 2 fingers, the lightest contact, and in a voice so quiet it was nearly only breath, she said, "We found someone, Mommy." He stopped. "You can wake up now." The lobby absorbed that sentence and held it. Director Choi, standing at the perimeter with a tablet he had stopped reading 20 minutes ago, watched Hayan's face receive those words. He had been watching this man's face across 6 years of high-stakes operations and had cataloged every register it contained. He had never seen this register. He would say later to his wife, in the dark of their apartment, that it looked like a wall that had been load-bearing for a very long time, suddenly understanding that it did not have to hold the weight alone anymore. Not breaking, not crumbling, something more specific and more dangerous than either. The beginning of a question that the wall had never previously allowed itself to ask. Hayan got into the ambulance. He told the lead paramedic he was coming. He said it in the register that does not produce discussion, the register that assumes compliance and therefore receives it. The paramedic looked at him for 2 seconds, looked at the children, made a judgment, moved aside. Hayan stepped in, sat across from the stretcher, set his briefcase on the floor between his feet, kept the document envelope in his hands. Then the ambulance doors closed. The sirens started, and the distance between Quanhan and the controlled architecture of his life began to open. He looked at her face on the stretcher. The paramedics worked around her with the efficient choreography of people who have performed this specific act of intervention many times. They moved equipment. They called numbers to each other. They established IV access in the back of her right hand, and the needle going in was the thing that finally made Milo, sitting beside Hayan with their shoulders touching, turn his face away. He pressed his forehead against Hayan's arm. He did not make a sound. He simply relocated his entire self against this stranger's arm, the way a small animal relocates against the nearest available warmth when the cold becomes too much. Hayan looked down at the top of the boy's head. He looked back up at Jessica. The document envelope in his hands contained 6 months of her best work. The cleanest, most architecturally precise legal structuring his company had received from any external source in recent memory. Work produced by someone who understood not just the technical language of the law, but the geometry of it. the way structures could be built that appeared to leave vulnerabilities while actually reinforcing them at every load-bearing point. He had read those filings the way he read almost nothing, slowly, with attention he did not normally allocate, and he had thought, on more than one occasion, that whoever was building this framework was thinking 3 moves ahead of the room. That person was 29 years old and had been running on no breakfast and a delivery fee, and she had not been able to afford a courier this month. He was still processing this. The ambulance moved through Seoul. Mi had her face against her mother's arm. She was not crying anymore. She was watching Jessica's face with an attention so absolute and so ancient that it made Haein uncomfortable in a way he could not immediately locate. He identified it a moment later. It was the discomfort of being in the presence of a grief that was too large for the body carrying it. The discomfort of watching someone maintain a vigil they should not yet know how to maintain. She had already lost someone. The thought arrived without warning and landed hard. These children had already learned what it meant to watch someone they loved go somewhere they could not follow. They knew this particular vigil from the inside out, had sat in this specific posture of desperate watching before, and were doing it again now in the back of an ambulance with a stranger's arm as their only anchor. He looked out the window at Seoul moving past in the early morning and felt something he had been successfully managing away from for 11 years arrive through the back of his chest and take up residence there like it had always meant to. The emergency room received them. They moved Jessica through quickly, which was the correct outcome and also the most disorienting one, because it removed her from their proximity and left Haein standing in a corridor with 2 toddlers and a briefcase and a document envelope, and no protocol for any of it. A nurse directed them to the family waiting area with the specific gentle firmness of someone who had redirected many people in shock to this room, and had learned that kindness works better than authority when the person in question is not yet aware they are in shock. The waiting area was loud, warm, lit in fluorescent without apology. It smelled of coffee and antiseptic, and the particular layered anxiety of a room where people were waiting to find out what kind of day they were going to be allowed to have. Haein sat down. Mi climbed onto the chair beside him without asking. She settled herself with her knees pulled up and her back against the wall and her eyes fixed on the door the medical staff had taken her mother through, and she did not speak. She was performing a watch. She had decided her job right now was to monitor that door, and she was doing it with the complete commitment of someone who believes that sustained attention is a form of action, that looking hard enough is a way of keeping something from going wrong. Milo sat on Haein's other side. He was quieter now than he had been in the lobby, quieter in a way that felt loaded rather than settled, and after approximately 2 minutes of silence, his voice arrived small and careful. Is she going to be okay? He was not looking at Haein when he asked. He was looking at the door. He asked it the way you ask a question when you have already prepared yourself for the answer to be wrong. The doctors are taking care of her right now. But is she going to be okay? It was the second time. Not a repetition of uncertainty, a refusal to accept a deflection. Haein looked at the boy and saw the specific quality of attention in his face and understood that this child was not asking for reassurance. He was asking for honesty, and he was old enough in the specific way that grief makes children old before their time to recognize the difference between the two. I think so. I believe she is going to be okay, and I am going to stay here until we know for certain. Milo looked at him directly for a long moment. Then he said okay, and leaned against him and closed his eyes. The weight of that trust landed somewhere in Haein's chest that he had not known was still accessible. Not the weight of the hand in the lobby. Something different. The weight of a child deciding, without ceremony, that this stranger was safe enough to rest against. The specific terrifying gift of being believed in by someone who had every reason not to believe in anything today. He did not move. Director Choi arrived 40 minutes later with a tablet and a carefully maintained expression that communicated nothing and had clearly required effort. He sat down across from Haein. He placed the tablet on his knee. He opened his mouth once and then closed it again, which was the most intelligent thing he had done all morning. They sat in silence. And now the story requires something. It requires us to go somewhere Haein Kwon had not been in 11 years. Somewhere he had constructed every subsequent room of his life specifically to keep sealed. And we have to go there now because, without it, what happens next will not carry its full weight. He had been 8 years old the first time a hospital waiting room tried to keep him. January. Wednesday. His father already gone. His brother at school. He had been at the kitchen table with a math worksheet when he heard the sound from the kitchen, which was not the sound he expected, which was not dramatic at all, which was simply the sound of someone sitting down suddenly onto a hard floor. He had walked in and found his mother. He had called his father's office. He had given the address to the emergency operator in the small, careful voice he had even then, the voice that did not crack, the voice that delivered information without the interference of feeling. And he had stayed on the line exactly as instructed until the ambulance arrived. And then he had ridden with her and sat in the waiting room of Seoul National University Hospital in his school uniform, still holding the math worksheet he had not thought to put down. His mother had been fine. Arrhythmia. Medication. Home by Friday. He had sat in that waiting room for 6 hours not knowing that. 6 hours alone with the full unmediated terror of being 8 and possibly losing the person who was the structural center of his world, and having no tools for it and no one beside him, and nothing to do with his hands except hold a worksheet he had already finished. His father arrived in the 4th hour. He looked at Hayan. You called correctly. You gave them the right information. That was the correct response to the situation. He said nothing else. And Hayan had understood, with the specific devastating clarity that children access in the moments adults least intend to teach them, that this was the lesson. In a crisis, competence is the only currency. Feeling is a malfunction. What you do with your hands is the only part of you that matters. He had taken that lesson and built on it, floor by floor, year by year, acquisition by acquisition, until the structure was so tall and so complete that the boy sitting in the waiting room with the worksheet in his hands was not visible from the top of it. 26 years later, he was in a waiting room again, with a different worksheet in his hands. And 2 children who were not his leaning against him, sleeping now, their combined weight against his sides, the most specifically unbearable thing he had felt in longer than he could account for. Not unbearable because it was painful. Unbearable because it was not. Unbearable because it was warm and real and present in a way that everything in his life had been carefully engineered to prevent, and his body was receiving it like something that has been dry for a very long time receives water, which is to say without resistance, without strategy, without any of the architecture he had built to make sure this exact thing never happened. He was still sitting there 20 minutes after that when the nurse came. She appeared at the waiting room entrance and said the patient was awake and stable, and asking whether the man who had come in with her children was still here. Hayan stood before she had finished the sentence. He walked the corridor alone. Linoleum pale green under fluorescent light that made everything look like a draft of reality rather than reality itself. He stopped outside her door. Through the small rectangular window he could see Milo, awake now, standing at the bedside talking with the rapid, urgent delivery of a child offloading everything he had stored through the silence. Mee was on the bed beside Jessica, pressed against her mother's side, head tucked under Jessica's chin, and Jessica's arm was curved around her, and Jessica's eyes were open above her daughter's head, and they were wet, and they were present in the specific way eyes are present when they have just come back from somewhere and are relearning the value of what they can see. He stood in that corridor for 6 seconds. 6 seconds in which he understood, with a precision that felt almost clinical, that whatever was on the other side of that door was not a transaction, not a complication to manage or a variable to account for. Something he did not have a name for yet, something that had been assembling itself across 6 months of document envelopes and reference numbers and filings he had read more carefully than he had admitted to anyone, and that had accelerated this morning in his lobby and was now fully present and not going anywhere. He opened the door. She looked up. He had constructed, without examining it, a particular expectation for this moment. Gratitude. Professional distance. The careful courtesies of 2 strangers navigating an awkward intersection. He had been preparing for that version all the way down the corridor, building the armor quietly, the way he always did. She disassembled it in 4 seconds. Her eyes moved through him, the way eyes move through something when they are not performing for the person they are looking at. She looked at him the way she had presumably looked at every legal document that mattered to her, without flinching, without pretending to see less than was there. The look of someone who has 0 energy remaining for anything other than exactly who they are and is not apologizing for it. You stayed. Not gratitude. Not a question. An accounting. The notation of a fact she had not expected to be a fact, and the quiet recalibration that followed it. Your children needed someone. That is not all of it. He did not answer. He moved into the room because the doorway was insufficient for what was happening and stopped near the foot of her bed. He placed the document envelope on the side table. He watched her watch him do it. I recognized your reference number. Something crossed her expression. Quick, controlled. The movement of someone receiving information they were not prepared to receive and deciding in real time how to carry it. She looked at the envelope. KWAG 202411. Yes. The room was quiet in a way that had specific weight. You are Quanhan. Yes. She said nothing immediately. She was looking at him with an expression that had reorganized itself into something complicated and careful. And then, very quietly, almost to herself, she said, I knew someone was actually reading it. The questions that came back through the intermediary, the angles they pushed on, they were not compliance questions. They were engagement questions. Someone was inside the architecture. The indemnification structure you built around the licensing clause held 3 separate internal challenge attempts. My legal team could not locate a vulnerability. I read it 4 times. She looked at him. 4 times. Yes, that is the most significant thing anyone has said to me in this country. And something happened to Hayan Kwon's face that it had not done in the presence of another adult in longer than he could calculate. Not a smile. The precursor. The muscular acknowledgement that a smile existed somewhere in the geography of his expression and had been located. It moved uncertainly, the way something moves that has been still for a long time and is testing whether the joints still work. Me looked up from her position against her mother's side. You kept your promise. I did. Milo straightened with the authority of someone whose judgment has just been confirmed by events. I told me you would. He said it clean and certain. Then he said, I knew because he stopped. All the other people were busy walking and he stopped. Jessica looked from her son to the man at the foot of her bed. The man with the ruined schedule and the document envelope and the expression of someone standing at the edge of a significant distance deciding whether to cross it. And something moved through her that she did not have the energy or the inclination to pretend was not there. Is their family. Her voice had changed registers. Not professional. Something more direct underneath it. You mean for you. Whether there is someone to call. Yes. I assumed you would have information on file with the hospital. There is no one in Seoul. I came here 18 months ago. There is only us, just the 3 of you, just the 3 of us, your husband. The room changed when she heard that. Not dramatically. Internally. Something in the temperature of her eyes shifted and her voice came out level and honest. He died 2 years ago, before we came here. We needed to be somewhere that did not already know us. He absorbed this without filling the silence immediately. He understood the grammar of that sentence, the specific way you understand something you have constructed a version of yourself. The logic of choosing geography as a form of survival. The idea that a place which carries none of your history might allow you to build something different than the future the grief had already mapped out. He had done something similar at 22 with a career rather than a city, but the underlying mechanics were identical. When you are discharged, there will be a car at this hospital. And I would like to speak with you. Not about the consulting file. She looked at him carefully. Quanhan. In a hospital room. I am aware of the setting. Then what exactly are you saying? I am saying that you collapsed in my building. That your children were alone with that long enough that they ran out of options and stopped a stranger in a lobby. That I am not interested in sending a car and considering that sufficient. She was quiet for a long moment. Me had fallen back into sleep against her arm, the sleep of a body that has been holding itself together far past its capacity and has finally been given permission to release. Milo was losing his own battle at the foot of the bed, eyelids descending with the slow certainty of defeat. You do not owe me anything. This is not about debt. Then what is it about? I do not know yet. Exactly that. No qualifications. No architecture around it. Directly and without decoration, and then his eyes moved away from hers for the first time since he had entered the room, a single involuntary shift, as though the honesty of it had arrived somewhere ahead of his control. She watched him look away. She saw the line of his jaw and the controlled stillness of him, and she understood that what she was looking at was not composure. It was the effort of a person who has not allowed themselves to be uncertain in front of another human being in a very long time, currently experiencing uncertainty, and not yet having decided what to do about it. She thought about this morning. The alarm at 5. Milo at the foot of her bed because Me needed her juice, and the daycare had called the night before to say they were short-staffed. The dizziness that started while she was making their oatmeal, the swimming sensation behind her eyes, telling herself it was tiredness, just tiredness. She would eat after the delivery. She would sit down after the delivery. She had done this before on less. She thought about the lobby, the cold of the marble, the darkness arriving without negotiation. She thought about waking up and the nurse saying, "The gentleman who came in with your children is still in the waiting area. My name is Jessica. I know you know. I am saying it because you sat in a waiting room with my children for over an hour, and I do not want you to remain the man from the lobby. That is not sufficient for what this was. Hayin. I know that also." This time the thing that moved through his face made it further. It did not arrive as a complete smile, but it arrived as something with its shape, its warmth, its quality of involuntary realness. And she saw it, and her chest did the thing that chests do when they receive something they were not expecting, something that lands in the part of you where you have been quietly careful for a long time. Something warm and inconvenient and entirely disinterested in whether the timing makes sense. Milo finally surrendered, tipping sideways onto the pillow beside his mother's hip, with the total unself-conscious collapse of the completely exhausted, and was instantly, deeply asleep. Jessica's free hand found him without her eyes moving, adjusted his position by feel, settled him, all of it in 4 seconds of pure unconscious motherhood. The gesture was so completely absent of performance, so entirely about the child and nothing else, that Hayin stood at the foot of the bed and watched it and felt it reach somewhere in him that nothing had reached in a very long time. Rest. "The car will be here at 9. You do not have to do that. I am aware. Are you always like this, without exception?" And she looked at him with those clear, direct eyes, the eyes that looked at the world the way she presumably looked at every legal document that mattered, without flinching and without pretending to see less than was present, and she said, "Then I will be direct also, because I have exactly 0 energy left to perform anything. Whatever this is, the lobby and the ambulance and the waiting room, I see it. I do not know what to do with it yet, but I see it clearly. You do not have to do anything with it." Hayin, silence. That is also not how things work, and I think you already know that. The room held them in the full weight of everything that had just been said and not said. And outside the window Soul was doing what Soul does at this hour in autumn, going golden and low, and entirely indifferent to the human reckoning happening inside the glass. The city moving on its own rhythm, lights beginning in windows, the long, ordinary, beautiful persistence of a place that has decided to keep existing regardless of what any specific afternoon contains. He left when the nurse came for the evening round. He stood, picked up his briefcase, looked at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then said, 9 o'clock, and left before she could argue with it. In the corridor, Choi fell into step beside him without speaking. They moved toward the elevator in the silence of 2 people when one of them has just come from somewhere significant and neither has the framework to categorize it yet. 32 seconds. Choi correctly identified that this silence wanted nothing from him and was accordingly quiet. In the elevator, Hayin turned the document envelope over in his hands. He read the reference number 1 more time. Then, to the space between them, get me everything she has produced. The complete consulting archive. All 6 months. Tonight. The elevator opened onto the ground floor. He walked through a lobby that was nothing like his, warm and loud, and constructed entirely for human need rather than human impression, and through the sliding doors into the Soul evening, which received him without ceremony, the city at the end of a day that had not been the day he entered it planning to have. The car was there. He got in. He set the envelope on the seat beside him and looked out at the city rearranging itself from professional to personal as the light went, and he thought about a boy in a school uniform in a hospital waiting room holding a math worksheet. He thought about what that boy had needed, what had been present in that room, and what had not been present. What difference the absence had made to every room that came afterward. He thought about 2 small hands in a lobby, the specific grip of the last available option. The weight of being chosen by someone who had no other choices, and decided, in 4 seconds of pure assessment, that he was worth the risk. He thought about Mi's voice, nearly only breath. "We found someone, Mommy." He stopped. He thought about Milo pressing his forehead against a stranger's arm in the back of a moving ambulance, relocating his entire small self there without asking, without apology, with the complete faith of a child who had identified the nearest available warmth and moved toward it. He thought about Jessica's eyes across the foot of a hospital bed, the directness, the complete absence of pretense, the way she returned his name to him as though it were a simple fact. Hayan, not a title, not a formality, just the thing he actually was, handed back plainly by someone who had decided that clarity was the only currency still worth spending. He did not know yet what was coming. He did not know the car would arrive at 9 the next morning, and she would be ready at 8:58, the twins beside her, me holding a drawing she had made during the night that she would hand to him in the lobby without a word. A drawing of 3 figures and 1 tall figure, and a building and a large sun. He did not know he would fold it precisely and place it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and that 3 weeks later, reaching for a pen during a board meeting, he would find it first and lose the thread of the agenda for 45 seconds, staring at the folded paper in his hand while 7 people waited. He did not know that 6 weeks from now, he would send a message through the professional channel that was technically about the Hanyang file, and was not about the Hanyang file at all. A message that said simply, "Your instinct on the indemnification structure was correct. 3 internal reviews could not locate the flaw. You were right before anyone in that room had caught up." And that she would respond at 2 in the morning, which meant she had been awake at 2 in the morning, which meant the margins were exactly what he had suspected, and the work was being done in the hours the children left her, and her response would be 4 words that would close the professional distance between them as cleanly as a door. The 4 words being, "I know. Do you?" He did not know any of this yet. He only knew the lobby, the envelope, the reference number, the pulse beneath his fingers, hand inside his palm, and the voice of a 3-year-old boy saying with total certainty, "I could tell." Because he stopped. He looked out the window at Seoul. The city was lit against the dark the way it always was, the way every city is that has made peace with the fact that the dark arrives every day, and the light has to be rebuilt every single time, and does it anyway. Every lit window a decision. Every illuminated room someone choosing to remain in the warmth rather than surrender to what waits outside it. He had been outside for 11 years, had built his entire life outside by design, had learned to call the distance a strategy and the cold a tool and the isolation a form of clarity. He sat in the back of a car moving through Seoul with a document envelope on the seat beside him and 2 small handprints still readable in the fabric of his jacket. He understood, finally, what they had cost him, not the handprints, not the grief of one afternoon, the 11 years, the careful architecture. The building so tall the ground was no longer visible. He understood what it had cost to construct it, and what it had cost to maintain it, and what he had told himself the cost purchased, and he sat with that understanding in the dark of the car without managing it away. For the first time in 11 years, without managing it away. That is the nature of the coldest rooms in the world. They do not warm slowly. They resist and resist and resist, and then one specific morning, one frequency finds the wall you forgot to reinforce, and the warmth that enters does not arrive gently. It arrives the way warmth arrives in something that has been cold for a long time. All at once, undeniable, and with the very specific quality of something that was never an intrusion. It was always what the room was built to hold. We are only at the beginning. If this story has reached the part of you that you do not usually let things reach, leave a comment below and tell us the exact moment it arrived. Tell us the sentence. Tell us the scene. This community exists for the people who feel the full weight of things and do not apologize for it, and every comment, every share, every person you bring here is how this story finds the person it was written for. Subscribe to AfroSeoul Velvet Diaries. Turn on notifications. Because what is coming for Hayan and Jessica will cost them both things they believed were already safely spent. And it will be worth every second of what it takes to get there. We will see you in the next one.